introduction, Bob. I want to say first, good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to the San Diego State University's Chinese Cultural Center and the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum for hosting this programming, and the teams there who have made all of this possible with the logistics and the organization. So thank you, Elizabeth, Muting, Yudan, and of course, the mastermind. Thank you, Lily. Thanks, Bob, for moderating. And Fiona for serving as a discussant and for letting us use your wonderful collection to illustrate the talk today. Next slide, please. So today I will be talking specifically about ceramics from the Cultural Revolution, and this was a period that lasted from 1966 to 1976. Many of you who do know about the Cultural Revolution probably associate with posters, Mao suits, Mao badges, and little red books, and probably not ceramics, because when we think of Chinese ceramics, we think of the beautiful blue and white Ming porcelain, you know, the Santai Tang horses and things like that. But I hope that you will see from our talk today that the ceramics from this period were extremely interesting and unique from earlier types of ceramics that were produced in China, specifically in Jingdezhen, the ceramic capital of the nation. And they feature a wide range of imagery and offer us a glimpse into the culture and ideology of the period. Next slide, please. So I'd like to begin with just a very brief historical background leading up, basically the main events leading up to the Cultural Revolution. As you may know, China was traditionally ruled by dynasties, this ruling family that received the mandate of heaven. In the early 20th century, in 1911, the last ruling dynasty, the Qing, was overthrown by revolutionaries led by Sun Yat-sen. And this led to the establishment of a republic with Sun Yat-sen as the first president. However, unfortunately, this did not last. There was a brief period where there was an attempt to establish a monarchy, and then things sort of dissolved into chaos and a warlord period where China was governed by regional warlords, whomever held military power. But in the mid-1920s, China was unified under Chiang Kai-shek, Sun Yat-sen's successor, and that established the nationalist government. In 1937, China entered into the Second Sino-Japanese War, which was part of the broader World War II conflict. And during this period, the nationalist government created a united front with the Communist Party. And by this point, the Communist Party had been around for over a decade, but it had been suppressed by the nationalists because they saw them as a threat to their power. But in order to defeat a common enemy, the Japanese, they united. In 1949, the Second Sino-Japanese War ended, as well as World War II, and thus the united front between the nationalists and the communists ended. And this led to the outbreak of the Chinese Civil War as the two political groups struggled for power. And this finally ended in 1949 with a Communist Party victory, the establishment of the People's Republic of China, which is now the modern Chinese state, with Chairman Mao Zedong as the leader, and Mao had gained, had basically emerged as the leader of the Communist Party during the war years. Next slide, please. So under communist rule, a lot goes on. There are massive changes in education and government reform, but I'm just going to go over some of the major events. And one of them leading up to the Cultural Revolution is the Great Leap Forward in 1958. And this was part of Chairman Mao's campaign to industrialize China and to increase agricultural production through collectivization. And unfortunately, this was disastrous. There was a man-made famine and millions of people starved to death. There was truly a disaster. And by the end of the Great Leap Forward, many high-ranking party members began to criticize the chairman and his policies, and they were questioning how fit he was to continue to rule China. Meanwhile, in Russia, Nikita Khrushchev, who had taken control of the Soviet Union after the death of Joseph Stalin, began a campaign of de-Stalinization, which basically meant overturning Stalin's harshest economic and political policies and dismantling the cult of personality surrounding the former leader. So while this was happening in the USSR, this actually had a huge impact on Chairman Mao because he saw Khrushchev's policies as revisionist, and he also had imagined himself as Stalin's Chinese counterpart. And watching this de-Stalinization, he was very worried about his own legacy. So because of the events in the USSR and this internal party opposition, Mao decided to embark on this final campaign to overturn the traditional hierarchical structure of the Chinese Communist Party, to purge his opponents and critics, and ultimately find a way to cement his legacy within the pantheon of communist leaders and thinkers. Next slide, please. And so on May 16th, Mao officially started the Cultural Revolution. And it began with Mao's denouncing of prominent party leaders and a call for students to rebel to ostensibly overturn the current social hierarchies and organizations in the name of forwarding the proletariat revolution. Students, heeding Mao's words, organized into militant groups called the Red Guards, who essentially took over educational institutions and worked to root out capitalists, landlords, bourgeois, intellectuals, revisionists, anyone whom they consider would hinder the revolution. So many of their teachers or professors who were intellectuals were purged from their jobs or imprisoned. They were rounded up and also sent to do hard labor. Many people were subject to struggle sessions, which you see an image of to the left, where they would be publicly humiliated, criticized, and beaten. And many actually died from this ordeal or committed suicide after. The Red Guards were also told by Mao to destroy the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. And this led to the destruction of private property, as well as a lot of cultural heritage, you know, temples, Buddhas, anything that was deemed as feudal. This movement soon spread from the schools to factories and other institutions as revolutionary groups took over and purged administrators or anyone whom they thought was, quote unquote, a black element. All schooling was stopped. As I mentioned, the teachers had been rounded up and purged, and the economy essentially ground to a halt. Over the first 2 years, the first 2 years of the Cultural Revolution were utter chaos, with this great amount of violence committed against many people and the mass destruction of cultural heritage and private property. The civilian government framework had effectively been destroyed, and Mao was successful in his scheme of purging the Communist Party of his critics during this chaos. However, by 1969, party officials realized the need to return to some semblance of stability. Mao deployed the military, the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA for short, and work units to disband these Red Guards. And so many students were sent down to the countryside to ostensibly be re-educated and to learn from the peasants, but this was a way to diffuse the fanaticism of the previous years. Next slide, please. The remaining years of the Cultural Revolution were far less violent and chaotic, and this, as you may remember, lasted until 1976. But even then, the nation remained under extremely strict leftist, radical political, economic, and social policies. And so the arts were tightly controlled. And this was part of Mao's goal of mobilizing culture to forward the revolution, that is, to popularize the arts and use them as a force to promote the Communist Party and Mao Zedong thought. There were very few correct styles and subject matter. It was really art that was determined by Mao and his closest colleagues. So I'm going to just give a quick overview on Mao's beliefs and theories on art. He believed that art had to serve the people. And by people, he meant the masses. And by masses, that meant workers, peasants, and soldiers, whom you actually see displayed on the screen. You have a ceramic sculpture of worker, peasant, soldier, and a plaque. Mao believed that art had to be didactic and revolutionary in nature, and it had to depict real life. It had to depict the masses. And so, as you will see in the ceramics, the subject matter was extremely limited to party propaganda and history and daily life of the masses. Next slide, please. In a belief that is very different from how we view art in Western society, art for art's sake was to be avoided, and the idea of personal expression was considered bourgeois. Mao basically condoned only a few styles, and these were the only correct ones. He believed in revolutionary romanticism and revolutionary realism, and rejected other popular styles such as impressionism or abstraction. These were also seen as politically incorrect. And revolutionary realism and romanticism were styles which you see here in this poster and this painting that were based on 19th century realist painting. However, these types of painting, by the time it developed in China, was meant to portray daily life, but in a very grand and idealized way. So you see these figures in these very strong, bold, and grand compositions, and they're always illuminated in a way that is very flattering and heroic. And this, of course, drew from Soviet socialist realism as well. And so these were the only styles that Mao thought were appropriate. Essentially, Mao's artistic policies were carried out by his wife, Jiang Qing, and the rest of the Gang of Four. And this was a group of radical, high-ranking party leaders who carried out Mao's edicts. Jiang Qing played an especially large role in the arts, and she was considered the highest authority in the cultural realm. And she set about reforming not only the visual arts, but as you will see later, also the performing arts. Next slide, please. So what happens when you have a traditional artistic medium with a long history, such as ceramic art in China? What happens when this meets radical politics? So the kilns at Dingzhen did not escape the Cultural Revolution. And as you may remember from the previous China Cube lectures, there was this very long history of traditional porcelain production for over hundreds of years. Unfortunately, during the first 2 years there, it was rather chaotic, and the kilns witnessed the formation of revolutionary groups and purges of administrators as well as highly ranked artists. Imagery and wares that were not deemed politically correct were either destroyed or they were discontinued. But thankfully, after the first 2 years, in the late 60s, production resumed, and the kilns were able to create a wide range of ceramics that were made according to revolutionary policy. Many of these works were Jingdezhen continued to make daily use porcelains, bowls and cups and saucers. But the ceramics we'll be looking at today were decorative in nature, and these were intended as gifts for work units or factories. They were not meant to be, the bowls and things you will see were not meant to be used daily. And so to the left, you see Mao mold for a bust. And this is in stark contrast to the ceramics you see on the right, which gives you a sense of the more traditional ceramics that Jingdezhen was famous for previously. Next slide, please. Artisans continued to make vessels in traditional shapes, but had to paint them with appropriate imagery. So as you can see, this gourd-shaped vase is made in a traditional form, and it even features some traditional ornamentation with the floral motifs that you see around the sides. However, the vase is made revolutionary by its imagery, and here you see the depiction of a female militia. And as you may know, Chinese society back then was extremely traditional and patriarchal, and women were generally relegated to the house. This ceramic highlights the new equal rights of women under the communist regime and celebrates their contribution to the revolution. Under the Communist Party, women were allowed to join as full members of the party, serve in the People's Liberation Army, and join the workforce. So in this vase, you see this interesting fusion of the traditional form with revolutionary imagery. Next slide, please. And here you have another example illustrating this hybridity. This vase is also in a very traditional form. You may have seen a vase like that in the previous slide with all the traditional ceramics, and it has this very elaborate red border decoration. However, the imagery on it is revolutionary. It depicts these sent down students, these urban youths of school age, high school, college age, who were sent down to labor with the peasants. And this vase is an interesting example of representation versus reality. Here you see the students looking happy and healthy, enjoying their time working in the fields. However, in reality, many of these students suffered very harsh living conditions, and they lost the crucial opportunity to go to high school or college while they were being re-educated. And so you have this generation of students sort of known as the lost generation who didn't have these opportunities. Next slide, please. In addition to these more traditional ceramic forms, which you just saw, we also see the development of new types of ceramic sculpture made by the specialized Jingdezhen sculpture factory. At the kilns, they created these multi-figure tableaux that were a new form of ceramic sculpture. And unlike the vessels, which were usually made on a wheel, these sculptures were made from molds, and each figure would have its own separate mold so that the figures could be mixed and matched to create new compositions. So in this sculpture, it's very iconic. It is a struggle session. It's one of those images that people immediately think of when you talk about the Cultural Revolution. And this ceramic celebrates the contribution of the Red Guards and their revolutionary zeal. In this sculpture, they are struggling against an intellectual, which they were called stinking old knights. But it glosses over the extreme violence and suffering of innocent people. And you see this dichotomy between representation and reality in between this sculpture and this photograph. Next slide, please. Within the arts, the Communist Party also encouraged the use of models. And by models, I mean exemplary figures or role models, within the arts that were meant to serve a didactic purpose, to teach people good revolutionary behavior. And these images of these role models were widely reproduced and disseminated across the country. Oftentimes, these showed the accomplishments of the party and of the masses. They helped raise morale and encourage others to work hard for the sake of improving the nation. And so many of these ceramics produced during this period depict these model workers and projects. This ceramic celebrates the completion of the model project, the Red Flag Canal, which was a massive irrigation project built entirely by hand. It was constructed to bring water to a very arid region in the Henan province that had issues with erosion and drought. And after the canal's completion, it was held up by the Communist Party as an example of the power of the masses and how the people, when applying Chairman Mao's thought, can bend nature to their will. Next slide, please. The Dating oil field was another model project that was very popular in party imagery. The oil field became a national model in 1964, and Mao called on industrial workers to learn from the site and to imitate the tireless workers there. Following the cooling diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union in the 1950s, China sought to be independent from Soviet industrial aid, and so developing their own oil reserves was key to that. Dating became China's first major site of oil production, and because of its productivity, the site and its workers were held up as models. And so you see the miners here who are depicted in these heroic poses with a red flag billowing behind them. One of them is holding up a red book demonstrating how they follow Mao Zedong thought, and that is that they're revolutionary in nature. Next slide, please. So in addition to model projects, you have model workers. These are individuals who were commended for working tirelessly and selflessly for the sake of the nation, and they were held up by the Communist Party as heroes. Wang Jingqi was a team leader at Dating, and he was known as the Iron Man because of his tireless dedication to work, continuing in spite of fatigue and injury. And he became a national labor model to encourage others and was frequently depicted in party posters. Next slide, please. Another type of model hero is represented by this Red Guard youth, Jin Sunhua. And he was originally a sent down youth from Shanghai. And during a flood, some power poles became loose. He and another youth jumped into the river to save them. And he died while trying to save his comrade from drowning. And so this youth was held up as a revolutionary martyr to inspire other youths to sacrifice for the party and for the revolutionary cause. Next slide, please. Norman Bethune is another interesting model hero who is promoted by the CCP, and he's particularly interesting because he's one of the very few non-Chinese models. He was originally a surgeon from Canada who traveled to China to join the communist cause during the Sino-Japanese War. He joined the Communist Army and he worked to bring healthcare to rural populations and cared for wounded soldiers. He unfortunately died in action due to blood poisoning, but was remembered afterwards for his service to the Communist Party, and later became an essential figure in one of Mao's essays that was widely studied by people across China, that was featured in the Little Red Book. Next slide, please. So I've talked about model projects and model workers and these model heroes, but the government also promoted a set of model performances, the Yang Fanqi, that were developed by Mao's wife, Jiang Qing. These model performances were codified and disseminated widely across the nation as an example of what the performing arts should be. This Jiang Qing had initially, in the early 1960s, she realized the need to reform traditional Beijing opera. She wanted to purge it of its feudal aspects and infuse it with revolutionary content. She also wanted to modernize it by incorporating elements from Western music and dance. And so during the early 1960s, she worked with a large team of composers, directors, set designers, writers, other people who worked in the performing arts to create a set of 8 performances that were codified and disseminated. There were 5 Beijing-style operas, 2 ballets, and 1 symphony. These were works that were basically screened and played across the nation. They were in radios. They was played on the radio. Film versions were played in theaters. There were mobile screenings sent as teams, projection teams were sent out to the countryside to bring the arts to the peasants and rural populations, and mobile theater troupes also performed these. The works were also reproduced in book form, in comic form. They were everywhere, and many people during the Cultural Revolution said that this was the only form of entertainment, oftentimes the only form of entertainment available to them. These works were all didactic. They all involve revolutionary plot lines, often dealing with a story from the pre-liberation or pre-1949. They were intended to promote revolutionary feelings and teach good behavior. And the plot lines are rather simplistic, with these depictions of characters in clear black and white terms, so that there is no confusion between who is good and who is bad, whom you should imitate to be a good revolutionary. So here you see a lampstand featuring a character from one of the model performances, the ballet, The White-Haired Girl. The White-Haired Girl tells the story of a peasant girl who flees from an abusive landlord and hides in the mountains. And during her time eking out an existence, her hair turns white from her suffering. Eventually, the landlord is defeated by the communist army, and the main character, Yang Xiar, is reunited with her fiance, and there is a happy ending. This work is especially interesting because it was meant to be a lampstand. We don't have the original lighting fixture anymore, but it would be very similar to having a Star Wars lamp these days. So you can see how ubiquitous these performances really were. And it's also an example of Jiang Qing's fusion of Chinese performing arts with Western dance, because she's depicted in a traditional ballet move. She is on point with her arm and leg raised. And to the right, you see a film still with the character in a similar pose. Next slide, please. And so aside from model performances, heroes, and projects, ceramicists also created landscapes, often painted on vases or on plaques. And these works are especially interesting, not only because of the great detail and skill that goes into their creation, as you can see, but because of the style. And you may notice that they look very different from the works we've previously seen. These landscape paintings reference traditional ink painting. And traditional ink painting during this period was a form of art that was very fraught and highly debated. Some people in the Communist Party believed that it was feudal, it was traditional, it was representative of China's feudal past, and it was hierarchical and classist because ink painting was traditionally made by the elite. And so they thought that it should be forgotten. However, other members of the party believed that ink painting was distinctly Chinese, an important part of the nation's heritage. And so because of these debates surrounding traditional ink painting, many genres of it were banned, such as bird and flower painting, the depiction of flowers in nature, because theorists believed that it lacked any revolutionary content. Landscape, however, was allowed if it was revolutionary. And so you see these very interesting hybrid images where you have traditional landscape forms such as craggy rocks and bodies of water and flowers and mists, but infused with revolutionary elements, and these references to agricultural production, to industry, to mining. So here you see these examples of these with these mountainous landscapes combined with a steel refinery to your left, and to your right, a coal mine. I think it's very interesting juxtaposition and blending of the traditional with distinctly Communist Party imagery. Next slide, please. And of course, ceramics also depicted imagery that centered on the PRC's broader goals and international relations, and essentially the propaganda surrounding this. As I've mentioned, China was extremely concerned with increasing in its industrial might, with the goal of surpassing both the United States and the United Kingdom in 5 years, which, as we know, did not actually happen. But rocket power in the military was also a part of this industrial, this show of industrial force. And this ceramic propagandistically encourages and celebrates Chinese military development. And personally, this is one of my favorite ceramics. It is, I think it's fascinating. Next slide, please. China also saw itself as the big brother to other communist nations or revolutionary causes. And China at times exported goods, industrial technology, and even propagandistic materials, such as translations of the Little Red Book, to these groups in other nations, especially in Southeast Asia and in Latin America and in Africa. As you can see, this ceramic is paired with a poster depicting or highlighting the communist cause against American imperialism. And in the ceramic, we see peoples from other nations who were also fighting for the communist cause, specifically in Africa and Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. And lastly, I would like to talk more about the cult of Mao, of the chairman Mao, and this was really a key element of the Cultural Revolution. Since the establishment of the People's Republic, Mao had been held up as the supreme leader. But during the Cultural Revolution, this reverence and worship for the chairman grew to the point where he was ubiquitous and a part of every person's life. He essentially became this quasi-religious figure with this cult of personality surrounding him. People were required to study the Little Red Book and quote him, for example. They wore Mao badges, showing their loyalty, and oftentimes people would have busts or paintings of Mao hung in their homes. Naturally, important events in Mao's life were national celebrations, including his famous 1966 swim in the Yangtze River. This occurred just shortly after he announced the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, and it was made to celebrate his previous swim in the river 10 years earlier. And Mao was very savvy. He made this into a massive media event that was meant to show him swimming with the people, and also to show how physically fit he was, because he was quite old at this time, to show his physical fitness in swimming the river and thus being able to continue ruling the country. And another interesting aspect of this ceramic is that some of the figures, such as the woman playing cymbals and the man playing the drums, they were also used in the ceramic depicting the Red Flag Canal. And so it highlights this reuse of molds for different compositions. Another interesting aspect is the fact that Chairman Mao is standing on a platform, if you look closely. This was because of the use of models and molds to create the ceramics. And so the Chairman Mao sculpture is just a little bit smaller than the other figures. However, according to revolutionary art policy, Chairman Mao, as the most important figure, has to be in the center of the composition and has to be taller than everyone else. So in order to fix this, the ceramic artisan who created this was very clever and put him on a pedestal. Next slide, please. The loyalty dance was another fascinating aspect of the Mao cult. It was essentially a set of dance moves meant to demonstrate respect to the chairman, and people of all ages were expected to perform it. This ceramic depicts, men, women, children in army uniform, holding hearts that say 忠 or loyalty in Chinese, and the man is holding a decorative plaque. You can't really see it in the image here, but it has a profile of Chairman Mao on it, and this is a reference to the loyalty dance. And to the right, you see a 5-year-old performing the loyalty dance for People's Liberation Army soldiers. And when you think about it, it is really incredible that this leader had a dance made for him. I can't think of any other world leaders who had that. Next slide, please. And the last type of porcelain I would like to talk about today is 7501 porcelain. In spite of his public belief that luxury goods were bourgeois, the chairman had special porcelains made for him, and these were called 7501 porcelain. They were essentially a code name referring to the year they were made in 1975. This porcelain, especially compared to that produced for daily wear for the masses, was extremely high in quality. It's translucent and features these very carefully painted designs. The works were carefully guarded and kept under high quality control. So anything deemed imperfect was supposed to be destroyed. And ironically, as you can see here, these ceramics are not decorated with revolutionary themes, but with traditional floral imagery, in this case, plum blossoms, which is hypocritically would be imagery that is considered bourgeois and politically incorrect. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to show you a little clip of a film that Lily helped create, interviewing artisans in Jingdezhen they themselves had worked on the creation of 7501 porcelain. So Muting, could you please play the clip?
所有的这些技艺人员呢，大家只是完成当教课的任务，其他什么都没想，也想不来，更不知道是毛主席用词。如果是毛主席用词的话，那整个景德镇都丰润起来了。哎，是在秘密的情况下才叫7501。那么这个7501是我们所里讲的是75年来第一个75年当年呢。 第一个中央下的重要的任务，我们就不叫其他的名字了，就叫7501毛子，是这样的来源。
研究所接到这个重要任务，全体人员既光荣又紧张。 唯恐不能圆满完成。当时集中了中国最优秀的陶瓷人才，开始了紧张的工作。这位老人叫徐亚凤，是中国高级工艺美术师，师从舅舅，也是珠山八友之一的刘宇岑大师。他如今已80岁高龄，当年曾参与设计和绘制7501水点桃花系列瓷具，那时的情景还历历在目。
我那个时候在艺术室，就是艺术室全部人员去开会，开会呢就是讲这个重要任务，也没讲是主席用神，没讲，叫重要任务，就是要我们搞设计，梅花呀，那个桃花呀，还有那个竹子啊这些。但是他要的任务蛮多的，那几千套吧。我们艺术室才10来个人，就是不行。后来还调了市里一些高手啊，后来才知道是那个主席用词啊，我们就好激动哦！哇，主席用词，我们还没画过，还蛮兴奋的。
最后，徐亚凤的设计稿被选上了，做釉上的绘画制作。因是流水作业，徐亚凤负责点花朵。
好长的桌子，我就在第1个位置上。我边上就是王新郎老师，他就是画那个杆子啊，画那个椰子啊，那个，反正我还有刘平，就是专门搞那个花朵。
7501使用的水点桃花绘画技法。先用玻璃白水点花瓣，画出花形，再用水调彩料在玻璃白上做第2次点染，下笔准确清洁，画出了桃花那特有的娇美和端庄。
加班加点。我们那个好辛苦，因为急着要，那个又哈的又出问题了，又窑炉不是收裂了就是收爆了，要赶又上，就是
原来的时候啊，我们一个车子要到收油的地方去，收到1430度，都所长都要讲好，不要再过去了。因为你的车过去的动静呐，那个轰鸣声呐，很容易震动地表，然后传感到窑，一到了窑下面，它里面像水一样的1400度的室温，它的这个耐火材料啊，也就都几乎要倒。如果你一震动的话，那它就整个往下流掉了。所以当时来讲，每一个细节都比那个出生儿子还照顾得细腻。
7501的造型呢，它整个都是量身定做，它每一个器皿都是跟主席的生活习惯来做的。你就包括有像这件就很特质的，在其他上面是没有过的。你说这个烟缸，这就是量身定做。你仔细看，这个烟缸它只有1个洞，2个槽。一般烟缸是3个槽，2个洞，因为主席啊，他2个沙发嘛，中间1个茶几嘛，他不会接待很多人，他最多接待1个人坐在旁边。再就是他的每件器皿呢都带盖，这就考虑呢主席工作比较忙。再就是北方呢，它天气比较寒冷，所以呢，他每一个器皿都带盖。这也是其他的瓷器没有的。
7501瓷成品代价非常高，为了保证最优的质量，可谓百里挑一。
你生产一个毛石出来呀，起码要扔掉、摔掉3到5个，甚至是7到8个。这个瓷器跟这个瓷器收的温度不同，如果它的生面不对呀，又不行。它必须要 要整齐划一，它要在每个窑里选的配套。你像这里的世界是这样的，这个淡一点颜色，那个颜色重一点，它不配套的，它只有在那下游这个重的来好看，配这个。哎，所以这个窑温的问题啊，德系的问题啊，在当时就是很重的。只有烧到了窑，才能做好一点的，还必须要拿一些做牺牲品。它是中间一点点，就像我们是甘这样的。哎呀，下面的太甜了，上面的又太不甜了，只有吃中间一段。
750窑瓷一经问世，便成为经世之作。尤其是水点桃花，构图技巧新颖，造型秀丽灵巧，意境清雅优美。750窑瓷胎体白如玉，明如镜，薄如纸，声如磬，是世间少有的艺术品。
So I hope you can, I hope you have a better sense of the beautiful quality and skill that goes into Chairman Mao's 7501 porcelain. And these occasionally go on to auction and have sold in the thousands. Anyway, I want to thank all of you for attending today, and I hope that you have seen just how interesting and unique this period of production is for the kilns at Jingdezhen, with the development of these new styles and imagery. They really give us a sense of the culture and politics of the time, and they bring up these interesting questions of facture, of fiction versus reality, and how propaganda works on a broader level. And also, if you are interested in these works, I encourage you to check out our project, www.culturalrevolutionsceramics.com, which was conceived alongside China³, and it's essentially an online exhibition that goes into greater depth on this topic, and depicts an even wider range of ceramics than what you've seen here today. It opens on January 3rd, but you can also sign up for an email notification. And so thanks again.